full screen. So I take it you see the PowerPoint presentation.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay.
But it's not full screen, Thad.
Is it not? Okay, let me get rid of that thing. How is that?
There we are. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to start off with a bit of an introduction about myself for people who don't know me. As you can tell from my accent, I'm from the US originally, but I've lived in South Africa since 1999, so well over 20 years. I've lectured at 3 different South African universities, initially Wits and then UJ for 12 years. But then I joined the University of Pretoria last year. I'm a philosopher and have based in philosophy departments. I do work particularly in ethics, politics and law, religion, and the meaning of life, of all things. And I want to mention that my research has been rated as A by the NRF on 3 occasions. And part of what that means is that it's had some international influence. And I attribute a chunk of that to the networking I've done. So I'm going to give you some concrete advice, and a lot of it is anecdotal about what I've seen work for me and other people in my career of some 25 years. However, you can also do research on networking. And there's some studies of how it works and how effective it is. And I did encounter one study that suggested about 50% of a person's career success can be attributed to a certain kind of networking, which is interesting. I'll speak, I think, straight for half hour, 35 minutes or so, and then we'll have at least half an hour, I think, for questions and comments. And then the slides are fairly text heavy. That's because I want you to be able to read them afterwards. So I'll send the slides to Prof to cut or another administrator, and they can be distributed to those who are in attendance here. So you really don't need to take notes unless you want to. I'm going to give you at least 25 or 30 different suggestions about how you can network. And emerging academics, those still pursuing their doctorates or even senior lecturers, for example, they won't be ready to do all 25. Some will just be too big, or you need to be established a bit more in order to take them up. But my advice to you is not to forget them, is to keep those kinds of suggestions in mind as aspirational things to strive for down the road in your career. And here's what I'll be discussing over the next half hour. I'm first going to talk about how networking works. I'm then going to give you my best piece of advice ever about anything. And then I've got 4 different kinds of suggestions about ways you can network in terms of volunteering, donating, making suggestions, and organizing events. So let me tell you what I mean by networking first. I don't mean just meeting people, right? Sort of shaking hands at a conference or whatever. I rather mean more specifically doing what you can to overcome isolation and to make use of what the academic community has to offer. And networking in this sense, as I hope you'll see, it's doable for introverted people and shy people. Those are 2 different things. It doesn't require a lot of socialization or small talk. You can avoid those things if you want, and still network in a variety of ways. So don't be put off by this sort of standard image I think many of us have in a business context of doing a lot of schmoozing. That's not what I have in mind. There are different reasons you might want to network, and perhaps in the first instance, many of us are interested in ways we can benefit ourselves from networking. And you can expect the following kinds of things for your career. If you network consistently, you can expect improved judgment and new ideas. You can expect more publications, citations, more speaking opportunities, jobs, letters of recommendation, and an improved reputation. Those things typically come in the wake of lots of networking. However, I think it's important to keep in mind that another kind of reason to network, and that's that you can help other people by doing it. You can improve other people's reflection. You can help your peers, students, and colleagues get positions, publications, and other goodies. So I think both kinds of reasons are important, both the self-interest and the collegiality or the morality, and I'll often refer to both in this presentation. As you'll see, a lot of networking of the kinds I suggest involves doing things for other people in the first instance. And so what often happens is you will do something for the sake of someone else, and that has the unexpected long-term effect of working in your interest. So it's not as though you just give a talk and then you've got a job. This isn't a once-off kind of arrangement. Instead, it's more like a way of life. You look for opportunities whereby you could help others with your skills and your expertise. And then doing so tends to pay unforeseen dividends down the road. And I'll give you a number of examples in the course of this talk. Although it's the case that when you network and you do something for the sake of others, you can expect something often in return, you can't specify what it is or when it will come. And so I do think you need to be careful not to do too much for others in a sense. So for those of you who attended my time management presentation last week, I would never suggest you give up your daily portion of scholarly labor early in the morning so as to network. Your own research should still be, I think, a priority. But in other hours, it would make sense to spend some time doing things for the sake of others where you can't identify specific benefits that will come from doing so. So my best piece of advice, some big picture advice about networking, and then I'll get to the nitty-gritty about suggestions about specific ways to network. And my best piece of advice about academics and really anything, I think, is go where you want to be. So if you want something, figure out where you can get it or what exactly it is that you want. And then don't wait to be invited to apply for it. Don't wait for an advertisement. Instead, find a way to get yourself integrated there and make a case for your joining the institution or undertaking the project or whatever it is. And so there are a number of examples here I could give. My very first job out of grad school back in the 90s, I had defended my PhD, but I didn't get I wasn't offered a job on the job market. I had some interviews, but nothing came out. My girlfriend, however, at the time got some jobs offers, and she picked one in Southern California. We were in upstate New York. And I thought to myself, well, what am I going to do? I don't have a job. I'm done with my doctorate, more or less. And I thought, well, if I go to Southern California, at least I'll have a girlfriend. So I decided to go there. And what I did was I wrote a number of schools in Southern California and more or less said, here I come. I've got my PhD. Here's my CV. Here's what I could teach. I'm interested in part-time temporary work. And I did that to, I mean, there are lots of schools. I think I did it to 30 or 40 different ones in the area. And I ended up getting 3 offers, one of which was particularly good. I didn't have a lot of work and it paid well, and it was a nice school. And that wouldn't have happened if I had looked for advertisements. Instead, I was proactive. I wrote the heads of departments, and there were jobs that weren't going to be advertised that were indeed available. Another example is my second, after that job in Southern California, I moved to the Midwest, Nebraska, and I had to find an apartment. I did look at the want ads, but I didn't only do that. I walked around the campus, on the edges of campus, and I figured out where it would be nice to live. So what was close to the philosophy department, what was close to the bars and the restaurants and whatever else. And there was a particular building that looked sort of fit my aesthetic. And then I went to the city and I figured out who owned the building, and I called that guy and asked, do you have any flats available for rent? And it turned out he did. And so I was able to get an apartment in the apartment building where I wanted to live. And a third example, one of my former students wanted to work for a consulting agency, I think McKinsey it was, and he didn't really have a background in economics or business. He had done his master's with me in philosophy, and in particular on Aristotle, very, very dead Greek philosopher. But he made a pitch. He put together a very pristine CV. He wrote a motivation about his background and what he thought he had to offer. And he got an interview. He was one of 3 to get interviewed for a position at McKinsey, if I remember right. At the end of the interview, they did say to him, well, you know, Tristan, you don't really know anything about business. And he said, yeah, I know. And so he didn't get that job. But what they did do is give him another job. I don't think he was given a permanent position, but he was given a once-off consultancy. I think he wrote a report for them or something like that. So something came of it. So those are just a handful of examples of what I mean by going where you want to be. Some of you at this point might be suggesting that if you were to do that in your academic careers, you wouldn't have much luck. And some of you will be thinking, well, if Metz is doing that stuff now, he's got some name recognition in his field or status, and that's why he's able to network. But the point I want to make is that while that is, of course, to some extent true, it's also the case that successful networking helped me and will likely help you get yourself name recognition and status in the first place. And that might involve some kind of gestalt shift for some of you to think that, okay, it's not merely success that brings networking, but networking that brings success. Some of you will think that this kind of attitude would be frightfully nice to have, but you don't got it. You might lack the self-esteem to put yourself out there. And I admit it would be often easier to put yourself out there if you had a certain confidence. But I urge you to do it anyway, even if you don't have confidence at this point in your life or your career. So figure out what would be good for you and, expect the feelings to come later. Or there's a title of a self-help book, I think it's called Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway. So the mere fact that you're scared of something isn't necessarily a terrific reason to avoid doing the thing. So you might be afraid of doing something, but if it would be good for you, consider whether you can muster the courage just to do it anyway, in the awareness fear might down the road, or frankly, it might not. It doesn't really matter, just so long as you actually do what's good for you, as opposed to focus on whatever your feelings are telling you to do. They can provide information, but they're not terribly reliable guides. And I do recognize this is a real puzzle for the humans, that confidence and esteem and the willingness to take risks often comes from success. But in order to be successful, you've got to be able to take some risks, and it would be frightfully nice to have some confidence in the first place. And that's a catch-22. My advice, briefly, at this point, and I can say more about it in another presentation on grappling with emotional blocks to research, is to make some efforts, take some steps, even though it feels uncomfortable. When you succeed, savor that success. And when you don't succeed, don't take it lying down, but talk about what happened with a mentor and figure out, whether you could have done something differently or whether it was just a matter of bad luck and you need to keep trying. Okay, so I'm done with the bit of sort of psychology and life philosophy there. And now we'll give you some specific suggestions about ways you can network. And first, I'm starting with volunteering your labor in various kinds of ways. So first off, you could today go volunteer to do some admin for your department or your faculty or your society or your association, whatever it is. You could write your head and ask about how you could contribute to the running of the department if you're not already doing it, or you think you could and should be doing more. If you do that, you might suggest particular roles or committees that you think would be suitable for you. And furthermore, I think you shouldn't be shy about suggesting new positions. Oopsie daisy, that just disappeared. Let's come back, there we go. Suggesting new positions that don't already exist. And in fact, these kinds of presentations about how to network and how to publish and how to manage time, at least in the Faculty of Humanities, I think they started because I suggested them to the dean at the time, soon after I had joined UJ. If you're inclined to do that, send your CV along with an email. Another thing you could do is volunteer to comment on a draft of somebody's research. If you do that, always sort of use the sandwich technique of starting with something positive and then providing some critical comments and ending up with something positive and in a tone you'd want to receive. Doing this for others, again, it doesn't immediately suggest that you're going to benefit from doing it, but you can. And I do remember I commented on one postdoctoral fellow's draft at UJ. She wasn't my postdoctoral fellow, she was another's. But she appreciated the advice, and down the road, after some years, she became an editor of a book, and she invited me to contribute a chapter to the book. It wasn't merely because I had commented on her draft, no doubt, but it probably helped her have me in mind. You could volunteer to review a book for a journal. And if you want to do that, write the editor and to do a book review, or you can even write to an author of a new book and suggest reviewing it and to ask whether that person can arrange a copy of it for you. If you're interested in doing that, send your CV and with a focus on your research background. There are times where a journal will list books it has available for review, but other times it won't, in which case you should write to the editor to motivate interest in a particular book. Also, when it comes to journals, you could today go volunteer to serve as a referee. It's hard to find referees a lot of the time. I've served as an associate editor for some journals, and it can be a pain to find people willing to review. It can take a lot of time. So it's wonderful if we have people write to us and volunteer to review for journals. If you're not comfortable doing that, if you're still, for example, working on your doctorate or you're a new doctorate, you could ask your supervisor to do this for you. In any event, though, you're going to need to send a CV, again, with some focus on your research background. You could volunteer to serve as an external reader or moderator when it comes to undergraduate or honors courses, or you could volunteer to serve as an external examiner of master's and doctoral research for another school. Again, send your CV. This time you want to ensure the CV is beefed up on the research side and also on the teaching side. This will help you forge links with other scholars and departments more generally. You could also volunteer to teach. That is to lecture, give guest lectures, or to supervise or co-supervise postgraduate research. That's another thing today that you could volunteer to do for other people. If you do a good job giving the guest lectures or you do a good job supervising the research, presumably your colleagues would notice these things. You could volunteer to give a talk as part of a colloquium series. If you want to meet people in another department, just say, look, here are some talks I could give. Here are some dates I could give them. Here's what I would need in order to get there. And you never know what will come of it. You can also volunteer to welcome colleagues. And before COVID, I did quite a bit of this myself. If there was a guest speaker at a colloquium or somebody in town for a conference who just hasn't been to South Africa before, I would routinely just take them out for lunch or a drink and just talk to them about whatever, about research, of course, in the first instance, but academia more broadly. And in the course of doing these things, there were times where I suggested forms of collaboration that paid off. And that wouldn't have happened had I not just been willing to take these folks out to lunch without some preconceived notion of what might result. So one fellow, as I recall, was from China and had never been to South Africa. And I took him out for lunch because I had some interest in Chinese philosophy and had been to China a few times. And over the course of the lunch, it turns out that I learned that he's a translator of works in English into Mandarin. And geez, I wanted some of my works translated from English into Mandarin, and he ended up doing one that was published in a Chinese journal. I couldn't have known ahead of time that that sort of collaboration would take place, but it was an unforeseen and welcome benefit of just doing a good thing and trying to make somebody feel a bit more at home. So those were things you could, labor you could volunteer to do. And now I'm going to shift over to a second kind of way to network in terms of donating, just giving things to other people. In the first instance, you can donate or share your scholarly thoughts. That is, you can go to colloquia, workshops, and conferences and not merely just sit there, but make a comment or pose a question. If you're terribly shy to do it, then do it afterwards in the form of email. But when you attend one of these things, sort of make it a point to try to make one comment or one kind of intervention in the course of doing so. And often if you make a comment that the speaker or others find interesting, there's a natural kind of follow-up. By the way, if you're new to the game, once you do participate with people at a workshop, a conference, or a colloquium, and you've had some kind of engagement, it then becomes perfectly appropriate to keep in touch in some way on social media. And many academics are sort of happy to connect on LinkedIn or ResearchGate in particular, and even Facebook often enough once you've met in these ways. Another thing you can donate is your strategic advice, and that's particularly true if you're a somewhat more senior colleague. You can take time out of your schedule to mentor those junior to you, to help them think about what their goals are or should be, and to consider how they might achieve them. You can meet and provide input, for example, on how to apply for jobs, where to apply for grad schools, how to compose a CV. And I've done this a number of times, and I don't expect anything back from it, but things often do come back from it, I've noticed. So one colleague was, at the time, a student at Rhodes, again, not my student, but I had a conversation for about an hour with her about what she ought to do with her career. And she ended up, I think, doing a master's at Oxford in development studies, I think it was. And a couple years down the road, she was invited to go to Bhutan. That's this little country sandwiched between India and China. And there was a large conference on Bhutan's public policy there. She couldn't go, but she thought of me. And she suggested my name in her stead, and the relevant organizer was happy with the suggestion. And I got a free trip to Bhutan and was able to make some difference to that project. That was completely unexpected, but a welcome benefit. By the way, when I was at Bhutan, I did still more networking. So I met a colleague whose English wasn't so good, and whose sort of presentation needed some refining, and I helped that person for about half hour, 45 minutes, sort of sharpen the English and the presentation. And down the road, after a couple of years, that person invited me to Japan to give a talk at a center. Again, I couldn't have predicted that, but it was a welcome benefit of just taking some time out of my schedule to provide some advice. Another thing you can do is to donate your expertise, your judgment. So find audiences, particularly beyond academics, with whom to share your skills and your knowledge. And that might include lay people such as high school students or members of a professional body, civil society organizations, or just generally educated people. You can give talks, you can write op-eds, you can publish in magazines, you can give interviews on TV and radio or in person, COVID permitting. In all these ways, you broaden your connections with others. And it's worth doing not merely for their sake, but possibly in the long run for your own. You can furthermore donate your course materials. If you've put together course schedules, readings, homework assignments, lecture notes, assessments, whatever, give them to somebody else who's got to do the course. By the way, if you don't feel like doing that, it's not really up to you. In South Africa, your intellectual property, the work you've done at UJ doesn't, strictly speaking, belong to you. It belongs to UJ. So you really aren't entitled to keep these materials anyway. You can also donate your publications. So once you've got some publications, I wouldn't be shy about emailing off-prints of them to those who might take an interest. And I would do that regardless of whether you know the people or not. It doesn't simply to say, look, I hope you don't mind the position. I thought that you might take
But I can buy it in if you need it.
Yeah, it's just blocking my house.
interest in this publication that just came off. In addition, when I used to go to workshops and conferences in person, I would bring along hard copies and just leave them on a table. And more often than not, people would scoop up the hard copies. In addition, you can donate your publications by posting them online. In particular, you can legally do so at ResearchGate if you make them only privately available. But there are, of course, somewhat more gray areas about where you can post your work. If you think your work is important, if you think you've made a discovery, well, then share it with other people. It's a kind of gift to give to the intellectual world. You can furthermore donate information. So when you become aware of jobs, fellowships, or grants, tell people, and particularly junior scholars. And if you do this, you can do a mass mailing. You could just copy people in your department. But what I try to do is target specific individuals as well. So if I think there are one or two people who are particularly well suited, I will email them specifically and encourage them to apply. And I spend about, 5 or 10 minutes a day doing this. I'm on a number of email lists for philosophical events and projects. And every day I spend a little bit of time just thinking about who could benefit from this information, and I send it to them. You can, in addition, donate money. UJ is quite generous when it comes to DOHET subsidy, and you can provide bursaries. You can send junior scholars to conferences. You can help others organize debates, what have you. That's a way of making connections with people. For the last 5 minutes or so here, maybe 10 at most, I want to turn to suggestions. It's a different kind of networking from volunteering your labor or donating things. Simply making suggestions is itself a kind of networking. And at least in my case, I think it's been a particularly fecund way of networking in terms of my career. There have been lots of benefits that have come from this. So one thing you can do is to suggest a co-publication with somebody who's more experienced, or perhaps not, perhaps just the same level of experience. If you're going to do that, be concrete about what you have in mind by sketching a concept note and proposing different tasks and some timelines. I do need to say senior colleagues will often say no, partly because they're too busy and partly because they just want you to go do your own thing, but it can't hurt to ask. The other thing you can do, and that I often do, is to suggest a scholarly contribution of some kind. So if you see that an encyclopedia is in the works, or an anthology is being put together, or a conference is coming up, and you see a topic that hasn't been considered as one of these, as part of these things, suggest the topic. And to do that, you would just write a short email. It doesn't have to take very long. You'd have one paragraph devoted to the topic and why would be of interest to the editor, given what else is going on in the project. And then you'd have a separate paragraph about why you would be the appropriate person to contribute to that specific topic. And when I do that, sometimes people come back and say, yep, great idea, and we'd like you to do it. Sometimes people come back and say, no, we're not interested. A few times people have come back and said, yep, that's a great idea, but sorry, we don't want you to do it. We're going to go get somebody else to do it. That happens, but that's okay. At least I've done something good for the project. And this costs very little time, right? It takes, 10 minutes to sketch, 15 minutes? I don't know what. It's not much to suggest that an encyclopedia, the editor of an encyclopedia admit a new entry on X, whatever X may be, and to explain your background in X and to attach your CV. It just doesn't take long, but the benefits can be quite substantial. And I've done it when it comes to encyclopedias, when it comes to collections, and even conferences where the format, where the program has been put out. There have been times where I thought, look, I've got a contribution to make that fits really nicely and isn't part of it. And I'm not shy about just writing and saying, look, if there's still space, would you kindly consider admitting me? And sometimes they say yes. Right? The worst that can happen is they say no, or your email is ignored. But the expected utility of doing this particular pitch is substantial. Let's skip that one. You can suggest a special issue or symposium in a journal. You can write the editor of a journal, the chief editor, and say, look, here's a hot topic, and here's why your readers would find it of interest. And you can indicate that you're willing to serve as the guest editor or compose an introductory essay or do some of the labor to bring things together. If you're interested in doing that, then ideally beyond just sketching the topic, you will include abstracts from potential contributors, a separate page with the contributors' academic highlights, and then your CV. And that too need not take a lot of work to make that pitch. I mean, you do need to get in touch with potential contributors ahead of time, but that's a few emails. But the benefits of getting this done, of becoming a guest editor of a special issue of a journal, they're substantial because you are then positioned as a leader on that particular topic. And it's unusual for editors to go out of their ways to invite people to be guest editors. It does happen. But it also is routine for people to propose special issues of journals and become guest editors by making the suggestions themselves. Another thing you can suggest is a review essay. And you can particularly do this if you're invited to do a book review. And I've done this a number of times as well. So I get an email saying, would you do us a book review of 400 or 500 words? And depending on the book, I will counteroffer, and I'll say, I'm interested, but could I please instead do a review essay or a critical notice, as it's sometimes called? And that's a longer critical discussion of instead 4,000 or 5,000 words as opposed to 400 or 500. It's longer, it's more substantial, and of course, it will garner you DOHET subsidy, whereas a book review will not. And so there you just spend a paragraph explaining why the book merits a longer engagement than a book review, and then another paragraph about why you would be appropriate to do the review essay and perhaps sketch what you would do in the review essay, toss on your CV, and you're done. And that's worked for me several times. The only bad thing recently, I did that recently successfully, I thought, and then when the review essay came out, it unfortunately had at the top of it book review. That's what the journal called it, even though it wasn't a book review, it was a review essay. And so I won't get DOHET subsidy, but I do get an article in a nice journal that I wouldn't have had otherwise if I had agreed merely to do the book review. Another thing I've done, or urge you to do, or aspire to do at some point in your career, is to get a reply from an author. So if you're invited to do a review essay on a book, for example, and if you raise issues that you think merit responses from the author of the book, then you might suggest that the author reply to you. So you can write the editor to suggest that the author reply to you, or you can write the author yourself and say, look, I'm writing this critical notice of your book. Are you in principle interested in responding? If so, shall we write the editor together? And that can work out. And in fact, one time I did both of these things. So I first was invited to do a book review, and I counteroffered by wanting to do a review essay. And then I wrote to the editor and said, look, could we get the author to respond to my review essay? And the editor agreed. So I effectively turned a 400-word book review into not only an accredited journal article, but one that was critically discussed by another scholar as well. And it wouldn't have happened if I hadn't made those suggestions, right? If I hadn't just simply said, negotiated with the editors. It's perfectly appropriate and professional to do these things. Editors like good ideas. Last group of suggestions is organizing various things. So just 4 or 5 more slides here. You can organize a social media group, a Facebook page, a LinkedIn group, an email list, something that brings scholars together around a particular topic. And of course, if you do that, you shouldn't be shy to post your own materials while you're also being sure to highlight other people's work as well. You can organize a talk. If you can't go to the person, you could bring the person to you, particularly using your DOHET subsidy. You could convene a workshop or a conference or just invite an academic to give a talk on her own. And that it would be a way of meeting people. You can organize a visit. You might want to go to where the other person is. And so the phrase for doing that is visiting scholar. And so you could write a person to say, I know you're based at wherever, and do you mind if I visit? Here's what I'm interested in. Here's what I would like from you from time to time. Here's what I would need from you, hopefully not very much at all. And here's what I could offer to you. Again, perfectly professional and appropriate, and is a good way to deepen a connection. I think finally, I think that my last major suggestion is you can organize a memorandum of understanding, and institutions particularly like formal agreements with other institutions to engage in joint activities. These are normally handled way up top by the MEC, but you could get the ball rolling and oversee some of the arrangements. You don't need to do these things, of course, in order to collaborate with other specific individuals, but it's one way of networking, not merely between specific academics, but between institutions. I think that's pretty much it that I've got to offer you folks today. I just want to end with some reminders or suggestions, advice. One is to remember that a lot of your suggestions, donations, etc., won't be appreciated. You can't expect a 100% success rate. I have no idea what percentage success rate I've got on these things. I don't pay attention. Sometimes people don't respond, and sometimes they're rude, and it does happen. But regardless, I think, please put yourself out there. Have faith that in time, your contributions will be recognized, and you will indeed forge networks of mutual aid. These kinds of negative reactions are rare in my experience. And the other thing to keep in mind is that I do think the talented recognize talent. So if you offer to make contributions and do good work for others, that sort of stuff is really appreciated by people who have good judgment and people who are not so insecure. And then the final point, the philosopher in me suggests that even if you can't expect to benefit from these forms of networking, they're worth doing for their own sake, or that is more carefully for the sake of other people. This presentation has been given in various forums over the years. There are some folks who have helped me or given me some input. And at the bottom, you've got my email address if you'd like to keep in touch. We've got, I think, until 1:30 technically for comments and discussion, but however long, I'm happy to see what questions or comments you might have.
Okay, thank you very much, Thad. Let's see, any questions? I'm sure there are lots. Who'd like to kick off? No one being bold.
Yeah, we need some boldness.
And
We need some networking here, actually.
here we are. Okay.
Do we just start talking?
Four hands. Let's start with Martha, then Jacqueline, then Ashil.
Okay, hi, thank you so much. I really like this presentation. I think I'm that kind of a person who takes up challenges. But I have noticed there's a culture that when you want to do something, then you need approval from your heads, like your HOD and the dean and everybody else, other than what you want to do. And then they say for you that you have too much on your plate. How do you manage that?
I think it would help if I knew some specifics. So can you give me an example of what you have proposed and you've been told it's just too much?
Okay, so we have projects that we do with U21, and there's 3 or 4 projects that I've been involved with. And then I have volunteered to work on another that was suggested this year. And I was told your plate is too full. But it's something that I know that I can handle and I can manage because it is within my scope and my time frame. And it will be done like over a period of time. So it is not like it will hinder any other progress, but that involvement needed the approval from others for me to be a part of.
Did it really? I guess that's my first question. I mean, if you want to use departmental resources, then yes, you need permission from a head. If you want to use UJ resources, you do need permission from a dean or a vice chancellor or what have you. But if you simply want to co-author a paper with somebody, for example, I don't think you need permission for that. Were you thinking of something more substantial, a conference or something?
Oh, okay. So obviously it will lead to that eventually. So you co-author something, and then obviously the expectation is you will have to go and attend and be part of the presentation. So in a state like that, you would need the approval, or at least you would need your head of department to know beforehand that you are going to be part of such a project.
Maybe I just had a habit of doing things without asking permission. I don't think I would have asked permission in that situation. I mean, if you're going to leave campus to go to a conference, yes, you need to ask permission to leave campus. And sort of to go on leave for a conference or whatever. But simply to engage in a research project that isn't going to take you away from your normal duties or use departmental university resources, I myself would just go do it. Sorry, deans or directors or line managers here. It's very hard for me to see why that should require permission.
Okay, great. Thank you. I love this answer. Thank you.
Good luck, Martha. Okay, Jackie.
Thank you, Prof. De Cut, and thanks, Prof. Metz, for the presentation. My question relates to publications and open educational resources, because it's my understanding that any publication or any, say for instance, a book, that you can negotiate with the publication or with the publishers and usually they make 2 of the articles that are published in the book, and they make it available as an OER. And is it possible then, and that is what I've experienced in the past, that you could negotiate with the publishers whether your article could be one of the selected OER articles?
Open access fees. So they'll list a fee online, and it often is 2,000 or 3,000 US dollars or euros. And I'm not shy about playing the Africa card and saying, look, you know, I'm in an African institution. I want to reach an African audience. Can we please reduce the open access fee? And sometimes it's waived entirely. Sometimes it's reduced to something that's reasonable and that I can handle from my DOHET subsidy. And then I also ask publishers to let me reprint papers that are already published. More often than not, they don't charge anything, or at least very little. But you do need to request these things. And if you don't go out of your way to request them, they're not likely to happen. And so the one you mentioned is really useful as well.
Yes, and maybe just a bit of context. Yeah, it was actually a research associate that I brought into the faculty that we were invited to also prepare a book chapter. And then he negotiated and he put up front that if he does publish in this book, he would like that one article to be made available as OER. So It was just an interesting way of thinking. But that also brings me to that when you have got an established network, that you can bring in research associates that can then co-publish with you in that space as well.
That's right, but notice the phrasing there. You suggest that once you're an established researcher, you can bring in a network.
Yeah.
The other way around, right? You can bring in research associates even though you're not established yet.
Absolutely.
And that will help you get established if you make these kinds of connections.
But it is about cultivating that relationship to first then engage with them and then invite them, or then put it to faculty to consider those candidates as a research associate. I think, right. But you made a valid point.
That's exactly right. It's just a matter about starting and cultivating a relationship.
Okay, over to Ashil.
Thank you. Thanks, Ted. So I've known you since 2009, and you've been telling me these things since 2009. And until recently, I wasn't doing any of these things.
Oops.
And I was thinking about why not. And Martha actually touched upon it. It's there are these deep cultural issues. Freud would call it the superego. So we hear Professor Thad Metz say, do this, do that, and we might have grown up in a society in which you have to ask for permission, or you literally can't go into that area because it's cordoned off for one group of people, that sort of thing. So it's not really a comment. First, it's a thank you for like the decade of pushing me to be bolder and more like you. And I'm happy to report I'm becoming more like you. Yay, I like that. But the other thing is that maybe a comment for everybody in this group is that you have to fight these other parts of you. Many of the things we grew up with aren't healthy for us. Yeah, it helps to have role models and mentors. And I guess this is what this program is about. So I guess, you know, silence that part of your brain, your heart, your soul that is holding you back, and then just proceed forward. So thanks again, Dad, for these reminders. Great presentation.
You're welcome. I do think it's a big life lesson to realize that just because you're scared of something doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. And some people don't quite learn that lesson. If they're scared of something, they think it's enough reason to avoid doing it. And I know people like that, and their lives are fairly narrow and circumscribed. But I do know other people who are scared, but they do what they ought to do what's good for themselves and good for other people, and their lives tend to be much richer and broad.
Okay, let's keep going. Lots of hands now. Matapelo?
Hello, thank you very much for the presentation. I'd just like to piggyback on the previous few comments or statements and questions in terms of fostering relationships and having long-term relationships as well. An upcoming researcher, I feel that that is a very big hurdle that I need to overcome. But also at the same time, it's about how we actually navigate those relationships and build them in order for them to be sustainable in the long term, because we do want to grow. We do want to have our research broadcast to the broader audience, but also want to be specialists in our fields. But I feel that as young researchers, that is the biggest hurdle that we need to overcome. And the AMP program actually helps us in fostering that relationship as well. So I just wanted to know what your comments were in terms of how we can navigate that and overcome these challenges that you're speaking of now, in terms of not actually trying to go over that hurdle or triggering those relationships in order for us to get there, because I feel that that is a very crucial part or component that we also need to transfer to our students, and that doesn't necessarily translate all the time, and we have to get into specific programs or apply for specific things in order for us to get there. Thank you.
I mean, in a way, perhaps you could brainstorm with others in your field or in your department about how best to make connections with senior scholars. But here are a couple of concrete ideas. One of them I don't think I mentioned was to join societies. So there'll be a society of whatever your field is. There's going to be something either in South Africa or regionally or internationally that's devoted to that topic. And one easy way to meet senior scholars is to be a member of that society and then participate in its events. And in the first instance, that means attending to those conferences and then making comments and going out of your way to meet people and talk about their research. So that's one strategy. And early on, when I needed letters of recommendation, so one slide I didn't include in this presentation was that when you're a junior scholar, you've got to leave the nest, right? You've got to get out from under the wing of your supervisor at some point. And after a few years go by, if your supervisor is still doing a lot of stuff for you, that shows up in your CV and that shows up in your applications for promotion and the like. And we, those of us who sit on committees, we see that. And we're instead looking for you to have broadened your horizons and made new connections. And so early on, I would go to conferences and workshops, and I didn't feel uncomfortable about asking for letters of reference for jobs, for example, if I'd had, if I'd given what I thought were some reasonable comments on papers, on talks, and had some kind of connection, even if it's just a 10 or 15-minute chat with the senior scholar. That was deemed perfectly acceptable in my field. Another thing I did was to host workshops that had scholars at different levels of seniority. So some very senior veterans, and some younger than me, so some doctoral students, and then with me sandwiched in the middle. And there would be a focused topic. It wasn't a big conference, it was a workshop. So it would include about 10 or at most 12 people, all focused on a fairly honed question. And those workshops were really rewarding. We learned a lot about the topic on the one hand, but because it was small and we were all in the same room for about 2 days, we got to know each other. And that, I did that not merely for myself to be able to meet more senior scholars, but also for the sake of my doctoral students and my postdocs so that they could meet them too. So those are two concrete suggestions. I'm sure other people have others. I hope they help.
Okay, thank you. Clementina?
Hi, and thank you so much for the insight. We feel like we have already a lot to work on. But then what came in my mind is at least 2 opportunities that I had to say no to. It was last year when I was still busy with my PhD, and I felt like I asked it actually also my colleagues. They said it seems like there's nothing much in it. And then I went away with the idea that if there is not much in it for me, then I should not be interested. But then listening to your talk, I'm like, actually, it's not true. But then the question I have now is, when do you know that it's too much? And you, at least as a junior scholar, when do you know that it's too much and you just can't take it?
I'm not sure I've got a principled answer about that, honestly. Because what counts as too much depends on what else you've got going on in your career and what your teaching and admin responsibilities are. And so I'm not sure there's a way for me to answer that without talking with you more specifically.
Maybe, yeah, to make it easy for you, maybe I would be a bit specific about what I had to kind of say no to.
Okay.
One of them was very much of community service, but I mean, yeah, more like community work.
Okay.
But then at a late stage, we were going to publish a book together.
Okay.
But in the beginning, it was a sort of community work that we actually at very late stage, then we were going to publish a book. And then in the Cape, one university in Cape Town also, they invited me because I met somebody at a conference when I presented a paper, because he heard that actually Taylor and Francis had already said that they would publish it. So he said, could you also come and present it at our university? So, but then I was feeling like the time to go to Cape Town, I'm busy with my PhD, I need to finish this. I just dropped it. And even the community work, I just dropped it because I was feeling like, what should I get from there? So maybe if you take it from there, we have an idea of what could you have done? Or
so look, I can't answer your question, but I can tell you what kinds of questions I myself would have asked. So for example, on the community service, my first question would be, how many hours? So, and for how long? Are we talking a month? Are we talking a year? I mean, these are perfectly relevant questions, and presumably the greater the number of hours and the longer the commitment, then you've got greater reason to reconsider participating. I think book projects are big, and they're big even if you're not authoring the book. I publish a lot, but I find it difficult to write books, and I've never edited books. I don't think, because editing books as well, it takes a lot more time than you think it's going to. So the question there would be, was that book central to the kind of academic you wanted to become as a doctoral student? So if it was directly related to your research on the doctorate, I think I probably would have recommended that you seriously consider it. If it was tangential and it really wasn't directly related to the kind of research you wanted to do, then that is a good reason to pass. You can always do tons of work for other people. You want things to be in the ballpark of what's going to be useful for your most important and vital projects. I doubt I've given you a satisfactory answer, but I hope I've given you some sense of how I would have approached these issues.
Yeah, I think I get a sense of what I would do next time. Thanks.
Okay, Lulama, over to you.
Thank you, Prof.
Sure.
Just I consider myself a very novice young academic from a research perspective. And you getting an email requesting me to review an article scares me out of my boots.
Yep. Good.
So I'm worried about just the quality of my review.
Sure.
Not even anything else.
But that's normal. And that shows you're a good person. You're conscientious.
Yeah, but you also don't want to I think it's call it imposter syndrome, worrying about you're going to send a sub average review and then you won't get any other reviews. So like any other scared person, I choose not to do it. So how do I work with that?
Don't do that.
Are there opportunities to co-review for at least your first or second one or something?
You can. So there are two ways to go about this. One is to do the review, to say yes. Look, if you are if you are finishing up your doctorate, you are an expert or pretty close to an expert in that field. You know a lot of that literature. You know a lot of the debates. You know a lot of the positions and the moves. And so if you're finishing up a doctorate on a subject, you're qualified to review journal articles on that topic or close to it. That's perfectly appropriate. So yeah, if you haven't done it before, you're naturally scared. You don't want to mess up. So there you've got two strategies. On the one hand, you can do the review and get a senior colleague to look over the review for you. That's perfectly appropriate. I've done it for junior colleagues. And you do that once or twice, and then they get the hang of it. But the other thing you can do is ask the AAMP to teach you how to do it. That's part of what this organization, right, this setup ought to be doing. And in particular, when I was at UJ, I used to give presentations on how to review articles for journals. And it would take 45 minutes, an hour, just like this thing. And if I'm not there, there's certainly somebody else who could do it. And so a bunch of you could learn how to do it all at once. So I think think about what you need in order to say yes to these projects, and figure out what you need and ask for it.
Okay. Sounds good, Thad. We must remember that. Guy, over to you.
Thank you, Prof. For me, it's just a comment. And I want to say from the bottom of my heart is that you have released me from your presentation, because it's like I will describe you as unconventional. And sometimes I was asking myself whether I was okay because of being unconventional. Today, your presentation at least told me that it's okay to be unconventional. Another thing is that what is settling in my mind now is that the balancing factor, to say to balancing self, that you give too much to others and you don't have time for yourself. And maybe because also of my own background, where you don't want to appear too forward. And then I realized that that's where I've been all along lacking, instead of also putting myself forward. But I've quite a number of things that you mentioned. I noted them, and I've done some of them. And now it's, for me, the idea that being unconventional is okay is now, you released me. I want to say thank you very much.
You're welcome. But in some ways, I wonder what you mean by unconventional, because part of what I'm suggesting is that these kinds of activities are done more often than junior scholars would recognize, right? The kinds of suggestions, the kinds of asking for things, of making proposals, of putting things together. It's what a number of senior scholars do routinely, but you just aren't aware of it. So I'm not sure I would say it is the convention, but it's a reliable strategy for helping others and helping your own research career. But I'm glad it did some good for you.
Yeah, for instance, the idea of putting the CV, I'll never put it accompany something with my CV, for instance. I never thought of doing that. That's what I mean by unconventional or colleagues or someone.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, if you're going to offer to, review an article for a journal or guest edit a special issue of a journal, if you're going to propose these things, you've got to back it up. You've got to give the other person, the editor, some reason to think you're going to do a reasonably good job. And so you need to make a case for yourself. And attaching the CV performs a lot of that function.
Okay. Naifa?
Thank you for the presentation, Professor Metz. I just have a request, if you wouldn't mind thinking back to any point in your career where you experienced fear of something, and how exactly did you overcome that?
Yeah, no, I still do. I mean, it's gotten less. I'm 52 now, and it's been, about 25 years since I defended my doctorate, and so I've been doing this stuff a while. And so there are some things that don't scare me. I do think I remember doing my first reviews, and yeah, I was pretty freaked out and got some help. But there's still times that I'm scared. So I think a most recent occasion was I've got an article that's dear to my heart. I think it's probably the best thing I've ever written. I think it deserves to be in a top journal in my field. But those journals are extraordinarily competitive. I mean, they accept somewhere between 2 and 5% of submissions. My odds of getting rejected are extremely high. And so and I don't, who wants to get rejected? I still don't want to get rejected. It still hurts. It still is unpleasant, even if the sting doesn't last as long. And so I guess most recently what I've done is just realized I can't win if I don't enter. Right? I have a 0 chance of getting in the journal if I don't send it. I've at least got a 2 to 5% chance of getting in the journal if I do send it. And I want to get in the journal, and so I send it. And it still gets rejected. That paper is still floating around. I think it's lovely. Reviewers are unhappy with it. And I'm just going to keep trying until it finds a home. So I think I'm going to be scared again when I have to submit it to the next journal. But what I try to do is focus, not on what I'm feeling, but pose the question, what would be good for me in the field? And the answer is clearly, if I really believe this is a good paper, I should share the paper. I shouldn't keep it in my drawer or on my desktop. So try to focus on that kind of question. What would be good for my career and for other people? And just do that regardless of the negative feelings.
Okay. Okay, then we have one last question. I think it's Thea.
Good afternoon, and Prof. Metz, thank you again. I always enjoy your talks and learn a lot from it, and I try to implement as much as possible. Mine is just a comment, I think, on what Achille said, and maybe a little bit of the Lama's insecurity that I also shared at the beginning. And I just wanted to share with Achille on the cultural aspects, and I just wanted to parallel a lot of what he said, on we don't always go and implement because we don't always have that culture. I find the same thing with my entrepreneurship students, where networking is as important. So one tip I got from a mentor, and he had a Harvard background, so of course larger than life personality, but he taught me and students, if you don't have that personality to, at first, and you have a bit of imposter syndrome, don't forget the power of thank you. Now, of course, saying thank you must be sincere and you must really mean it. It's not to suck up to people, but if you actually go and write that email afterwards and just thank people for what they, what you took from their talk or a paper that they wrote or whatever it is, and you actually really mean it and, unpack what it meant to you and what you took from that, I found that often, even in my own career, people actually invite you because they need cheerleaders and people, you know, that appreciate their work. So not that you are expecting anything of it. I just wanted to share that, and it works for students as well.
Mm-hmm.
And then just Lulama, I had the same thing with the journals at first, and even more so with dissertations and PhD thesis. And what I found is that you can actually ask the editor as well to just give you a sense of whether it was a good report. And they actually do. And there's a section where you can ask the editor, or you can, where it says, you know, comments to the editor, and where you were insecure, for example, a statistic method that you were not very familiar with, you can actually comment on that and say, listen, I'm not as fluent with this or that. And they're actually quite honest with you back. And these days I can't stay ahead with all the reviews. And the same with the examinations, just to ask the office, the faculty office, not to give you the report of the other examiners involved, but just to tell you, how did you benchmark? And they're actually happy to share that with you. And this is the way you build your confidence, because you'll see that you're actually you're not far off, and that just affirms. So I just wanted to share that. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tia. It's nice to be in touch with you again. And those are lovely suggestions. I'm going to crib them and put them into my slides with your permission.
Absolutely, no problem.
Thank you.
Okay, everyone, I think we've reached the end of the questions. So once again, thank you very much, Thad. And we will circulate the presentation to those who've been here. And just a reminder that Thad's doing another talk, I think in a week or so again. It's about NRF ratings. It's about strategizing about NRF ratings. So not how to fill the form, I think, but more strategy. So I'm looking forward to that, and maybe we'll see a lot of us again there. Thank you very much, everyone. Okay, have a good weekend.
Thanks for the engagement, people. I appreciate the comments and the questions.
Thank you. Bye.